Hello, hello, hello there. Nice to see you all, even though I'm not actually seeing you, and hopefully there's a you that I'm speaking to. Welcome to my second attempt at a solo live stream. Later today, I do have a joint live stream planned with Patrick Watson, around about 2 hours from now. But for the time being, I'm going to go it alone and talk about a few things. First of all, that people have brought up that they'd like me to discuss on the live stream, and also just some things that have been on my mind, things that I've been wanting to discuss in a forum like this, and I'll move forward with. Right now, a lot of people have been asking me because I've made these videos about, or at least this one main video recently about the Venus Synodic cycle. People are asking me if I teach courses or have anything like that involving the Venus Synodic cycle. Excuse me. And the answer is I don't. But I'm going to use this forum as some as a means for me to sort of develop such a course. So if you follow me along with everything else that I'm going to be talking about, it'll be um, sort of developing a beginning, middle, and end to how I present this material. Because well, I've got the beginning done with that video, and I'm working on a bunch of middles, and I don't know where it ends. But that'll have to suffice for the time being. Let's see, where should we start? Maybe we should start. This is, after all. Oops, now I've gone and pressed the wrong button. Pardon me while I go silent for a moment. I just want to see how things are going so far. Okay. All right. Now, yeah, people have been asking me to talk about the Venus Synodic cycle, and they've also been asking me to talk about like the history of music and things like that, because that's something I've written about in the past, and they want me to sort of get back to it. So I thought I would kill two birds with one stone, to put it crudely, and just sort of show you the charts of some different uh, musicians and which Venus Synodic cycle they fell in. And there's one very interesting pattern that I want to show you in particular. Now, so I'm just downloading. Um, where's my window here? Bear with me again. Okay, there we are. So yeah, I'm just downloading the slideshow. It's a fairly large document, so it takes a minute or two while I'm doing that. I can't have everything handy. My hard drive is actually quite full, despite having the cloud and all that. I've got a Taurus moon, so I tend to be a bit of a pack rat when it comes to digital stuff. Anyway. Okay, so while I wait for that to open, yeah, why don't I share my screen and take you folks through the database. All right, here we are. And yeah, maybe before I get to talking about the Venus Synodic cycle of musicians in general, I should show you folks my database and this thing that I've that gets mentioned here and there, but maybe a lot of you haven't really seen. This is my Solar Fire software, and I have been making for the past 20 some years, 24 years or so, and making charts and making files of different subjects relating to politics or the arts, all kinds of countries, all kinds of periods, although mostly the modern period, and cinema, literature, fine arts, politics, and definitely music. So all kinds of people. that I've been studying. And this is just, for instance, there's a lot of different files that I have. This is just my file of natal charts, both timed natal charts and untimed natal charts. So, in other words, just birthdays, usually with a noon birth time used if I don't have anything else. And this goes back to sort of, prehistory, Romulus, Socrates. Well, not exactly prehistory, but quite ancient. And but mostly it's made up of modern figures. You can see like this, all the 20th and 21st century stuff would follow right from about here, and it's maybe a fifth of the way through the whole file. So um, definitely more of an emphasis on modern history, but still I go back to, the 19th century is pretty substantial. The 18th century has got some stuff, but needs work still. It's always a work in progress, but this is what I draw from. This is um, when you see me talking, say, on the astrology podcast, or if we've had conversations in the past about transits and my interest in the ephemeris, and how I've sort of got it mapped out in my mind, and well, this is the instrument that helped me sort of do what I do, and eventually, hopefully, what I want to do is to make something like this available to people where it's more commonplace and not just this one toy that I get to play with on my own. But a lot of steps have to be accomplished before it comes to that. Um, Now, with this tool, so for instance, this is a chart with 13,676 charts in it. Lots of different people, like I said, from politics and arts. And what I can do using my solar fire is I can search things through a number of astrological or even non-astrological factors. For instance, if I just wanted to see every chart in this file that has um, the moon in Aries, I do a search like this, and in just a little bit of time, I get 1,117 charts that all have the moon in Aries. Going back to Prince Henry of Portugal from the year 1394 all the way to modern day people like Kiefer Sutherland and yeah, Jason Jones and now Anderson Cooper, who were born the same day. Jason Jones being the guy from The Daily Show. Yeah, Salma Hayek, I see here, Janet Jackson. There you go. All kinds of people with Aries moons. But I can do all kinds of searches. I can also look in this file and look for anyone who has, say, Venus opposite Mars. I can do that kind of search. And bada boom, bada bing, just like that, I get a bunch of charts. 158 charts out of 13,676 charts. There's only 158 that have Venus-Mars oppositions. It's not very many. It starts with the Emperor Vitellius from the Roman Empire and goes all the way down here. Oh yeah, Lily Borden. I remember she having that. Annie Oakley, Hitler's mom. Florence Harding, who's a first lady who may or may not have poisoned the president. Rosa Luxemburg, the famous anarchist. Yeah, a lot of famous people. Claire Booth Luce. She was a member of Congress or a senator, one of the two, and married to the publisher of Time magazine, Henry Luce, and definitely a CIA asset. Anyway, all kinds of interesting people. So yeah, I study all kinds of different facets of history using astrology. This is the thing that I love to do. I do also love to read people's horoscopes, their birth charts, and talk to them about their lives. That's the other really fulfilling part of being an astrologer. But when I'm not doing that, all things being equal, I am generally working on all this. Now, let me see. Hopefully, the screen is still being shared. All right. Is my screen being shared? Has this been working? Have you all been seeing what I'm seeing? Yeah, it looks like it is. Okay, cool. All right. So far so good. Um, okay. Yes, you saw the screen shares. All right. So my YouTube chats come into. I'm using Restream, and I just want to see how um, the chats follow me. All right. Cool. Um, I'm starting to get the hang of this. All right. With that in mind, what happened to my keynote? Did it not? Okay, here we are. I'll be able to open this now. Okay, so what I'm about to show you folks, yeah, like I said, I want to talk about the Venus synodic cycle and just take you through a few little nooks and crannies of the research that I've done and some of the conclusions I've come to, or at least some of the observations. There are a few conclusions. There's way more sort of observations that await conclusions. But I'm happy to share this with you. Maybe some of you folks will have contributions to make. Um, but yeah, if you haven't seen my YouTube video, Introduction to the Venus Synodic Cycle, then this will seem like really baffling and like no astrology you've ever studied before. It's not a very long video. I think it's maybe 11, 12 minutes long. Um, and it's got lots of pretty visuals and interesting music and the soothing tones of my voice narrating the whole thing. So do check that out and then watch what I'm about to do. Otherwise, it'll be a bit confusing. If you're really stubborn, if you just want to say like, screw you, Nick, I do what I want. I'm going to watch this without watching that video. At least not, I'm going to stick with this and then do it afterwards. If that's your vibe, I respect that. Um, you're not the first person to take that tone with me. It's just you'll and maybe this is the way it works out for you, and I really don't judge you for it. You can just sort of watch the introduction video later and catch up and fill in all the sort of gaps and questions that maybe you have while I proceed to ramble about all this. Either way, without further ado, or further ado, um, let me just make this screen bigger. Um, oh yeah, here we go. Okay, so I'm sharing my screen. So this is just these are the intervals. There's the phases and the intervals, and I can show you the phases in a minute, or in a few minutes. Like I say, it takes a little while to download these, and I can really they take up a lot of memory because they're quite long. This is just a list of all the musicians I've looked at so far, or that I've had the time to. I've actually looked at way more that are in this list, but this is just a list of the musicians that I've managed to put in systems so far. Um, it's mostly some, rock musicians, uh, some a lot of 60s stuff with some old jazz. I do look at older musicians, not just because I'm an old fogey, although that is part of it. But also I find talking about young contemporary musicians, it's a bit intrusive. They're still in the middle of their lives. If I take people who are either deceased or are, really, really like old enough that we can, look at their lives in a less destructive way, let's say. Um, and that's just my preference. I've talked about this before on the astrology podcast, but back in 2007, when Britney Spears was having her sort of public breakdown issues there, that was around February of 2007. I already had this slideshow, an astrology slideshow that talked about her chart and things about her career and life. And I had made it, like, leading up to when her life kind of was coming apart, and then I used that slideshow during a talk, and it's on YouTube, you can see it. I did a talk at the first Blast conference in, late March of 2007, so this was, like, maybe 5, 6 weeks after, the whole thing with, Britney happened, and, um, yeah, suddenly, I started to feel bad, like, here I was, there was just one slide that made her look a bit silly. It was just, for comedic purposes for a public talk, but then I kind of felt bad that inadvertently, I was kicking her while she was down. So that also sort of affected my attitude towards talking about contemporary musicians, like, their lives have their ups and downs. For the kind of work I do, which is really sort of detailed, best to use people who, where the bodies are cold, to put it, gruesomely. Anyway, so yeah, this is my file of different people here, and there are some interesting things that can take us through, like, different rock bands and look at their makeups and stuff like that. One thing I did want to show you, though, there is one interval that really stands out, and that's this one, the rising three, the white three rising C. Okay, so there's one classical composer, Claude Debussy, that I have here, and a great jazz, probably the most successful jazz artist in all time. I believe he does have the best-selling record still, in jazz music history. If he doesn't, only until very recently, but he's an icon. Miles Davis, and really sort of an absolute sort of unparalleled force in his genre of music, and he was far and above the most powerful sort of figure, and the best paid by far jazz musician in his lifetime. So he's a rising C. Then we get Partney. Okay, so he's one of the Beatles, but he's a Beatle with, like, a real musical drive that is distinct in that band. Out of the 4 guys in the band, um, he's the most versatile and, sort of technically accomplished. Actually, there's a great story in November of '69, just as the Beatles were breaking up, none other than Miles Davis, along with Jimi Hendrix and the drummer Tony Williams. The 3 of them invited Paul McCartney by telegram, to come join them in New York City for a recording session. But he was away in his farm and didn't get the message. This was right as the Beatles were breaking up after Abbey Road came out, and I always wish he could have received that telegram. But that's the kind of musician he is. He could have walked into a room with these really, really accomplished, top-notch musicians and totally held his own. And much as I love the other 3 Beatles, I don't think any of them could have played in a setting with musicians of that level and really sort of kept it up. So their talents, their strengths were very different strengths, not virtuoso strengths. But Paul probably could have done it. He's a hell of a bass player. So that's it. There's Paul. Speaking of super talented musicians, someone who makes McCartney and probably Miles look, small by comparison is Stevie Wonder, a mega talented multi-instrumentalist and singer composer, and just, yeah, a musician, on a whole other scale of accomplishment and capability. And yeah, the fact that he's visually impaired is just sort of, a side note, obviously very important to his story, but not nearly as remarkable as the fact that he's just, that he's the musician he is, which is just, would be, a stunning accomplishment by anyone's standard. Now next, okay, now you're gonna see, Rebby Jackson. She's the oldest of the Jacksons, because there's how many kids in that family? 9? I have them all. I can show you. It's somewhere around there. I do have them all, and we'll look at them. But she's a white three. Now she's practically the only one who doesn't have a musical career. I mean, or one of the few anyway. So why is she in here? Well, she's just in here for reference purposes. So let's just put a tab on Rebbe tour. All right, but next up, 8 years later, in 1958, we get the quite the superstar summer. Prince uh, needs no introduction. I've already been raving about the likes of Miles Davis, Paul McCartney, and Stevie Wonder, and Prince is absolutely a musician who is no less than anyone I've mentioned. Another just super talented, multi instrumentalist, visionary composer, musician. So his work speaks for himself. I can't really even say much more about him. All right, next up, Madonna. Um, Not a virtuoso, but certainly a visionary. Certainly a force. Certainly someone who owned pop music in the 80s. I mean, along with this guy and along with this guy, certainly they would be the big trinity of the 80s, I would say, in a decade full of memorable pop music. So Michael Jackson, what do I say? Okay, remember his older sister Rebby is also a white three, and he's a white three. Now there's so many Jackson kids in the family. There couldn't possibly be a third white three in the Jacksons. I don't know. Tune in, folks, or stay tuned. I'll probably be there in about 20 seconds. But anyway, oh yeah, actually, here I am. You don't need to stay tuned to anything because here she is, Janet Jackson. So three of the Jackson kids, even if there are 9 or 10 or how many there are of them, 3 of them are white threes. And this is something we see in families a lot, large families, is a repetition of the synodic interval through parent to sibling or through several siblings. I have a number of studies on that. But I just wanted to point out it's interesting to me, like this is just something that I noted. Like to me, it's really interesting that the likes of Michael Jackson, Prince, Stevie Wonder, Paul McCartney, and Miles Davis, in terms of like 20th century, late 20th century, contemporary music, easily 5 of the giants of that era. If you go from the 50s to the 80s slash, well, Prince was still hot in the 90s even. So but that whole period, I mean, these are yeah, towering giants. It's interesting to me that they were all born in the same interval. So that's one of the things. As you can see here, I do have a lot of different figures. There's yeah, Elvis and Jimmy are both blue twos, um, and yeah, I can talk about here's, more Jacksons. I told you I've got all the Jacksons in here. I've got a lot of different people that I can talk about, a lot of different contexts. And like I said, this list that I've made up isn't even, the main list. The main list is what I have here in my database. Um, like I showed Paul McCartney earlier. My Beatles file has 2,310 charts in it. So just all kinds of nativities, every recording session, every concert, all kinds of, personal, their weddings, all that stuff. Who else did I show? I showed Miles Davis. Miles Davis, I also have a pretty big chart file. He had a very long career from the 40s to 1991 when he died. So I have almost 600 charts for Miles Davis, like all the birthdays of all the musicians he played with, and then recording sessions, concerts, all kinds of things through the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s and 80s until his death there in 1991. So that's what I do with these files is I take someone's life and just sort of make the most detailed chronology I can. And then I can use the astrology software. Like, let's see, in Miles Davis was a Gemini. Just for kicks, let's look at everything and everyone that had Venus and Gemini. Any concert recording session or musician he played with who had Venus and Gemini, and boom, I just, there's a few musicians, including Herbie Hancock, who I think a lot of people are familiar with. Okay, who've got bingo, Venus and Gemini, or different recording sessions, like this famous tour of Japan where he really changed his style. That was during a Venus retrograde in Gemini. If you can see, it's just going Gemini in that during that, or it's just coming out of the retrograde rather. Yeah, there it is, stationing direct, just as he's beginning this tour of Japan where he really changes his musical style quite radically. Anyway, all kinds of things I can do with studying the lives of musicians and other people using this material. Now, there was something else I wanted to show you. What was it? Let me just check in here, see if the chat's saying anything, because I'm not looking at the chat. Okay, people aren't saying much. People aren't saying anything. All right. So it goes. I had another file I wanted to show everyone. Hold on a sec. All right. Bear with me. Okay. Difference between musicians who have lyrics or don't? No, no. Birth charts are really abstract. So you can get the lyrical or the non-lyrical musician with very similar looking charts. The chart will tell you a lot in terms of uh, um, how they approach their craft, and sort of the transits to their charts obviously give you some idea of like how their work evolves, how their careers evolve. But I wouldn't make a sort of broad statement. We're always looking for those, but those are really, really hard to come by in astrology statements where you can say like, um, yeah, let's say, but all non-lyrical musicians have Mercury and the Sun in the same sign, and all the others don't. It's just never that simple. That's why something even as remarkable as like, um, showing you what I just showed you with the white three and the musicians I found in there. I mean, it's just a few examples, but it was striking just because like that much of something really, even in that list of all the musicians who are in that file, those particularly those 4 or 5 that I singled out really are in a sort of unique class amongst their peers, and so that bore mentioning. But yeah, musicians, it's difficult to tell, like, if they're going to be um, um, like say what genre they're going to be involved in or what instrument they're going to play. The chart of a drummer can look like the chart of a guitar player, but it'll say something about how they approach the instrument, and how their musical development evolves. Do the rises to fame correspond with the Venus phase they were born in? Well, it's not always Venus. In the case of, like with Elvis, I see Mars playing a much bigger role than Venus. Venus here and there, but Elvis's rise to fame is very Martian, ironically. The transits really sort of follow him with regard to the Mars synodic cycle. When you see his rises and his falls, and then rises again and then falls again, it's quite magic the way they correspond to the Mars synodic cycle, which is definitely something when I get into his life that I would talk about. The Beatles similarly, mostly Mars. Now the thing about the Beatles is, um, I think of like out of the 4 of them, each of them has a chart that's really responsive to a particular one of the synodic cycles. And maybe this is what made the Beatles, is how sharply their charts connect to a specific planet. Maybe I do that if we're talking about fame. It's I know it's an obvious one. Samuel Reynolds was only just saying that it's an overused chart example, but just that no one's done the Beatles like I've done them, so I may as well uh, um, start with them, and also they're kind of a complicated example and a bit of an exception compared to the rule that I generally find with rock bands. Not entirely, just it's interesting the way the group is made up, but there are some interesting things to say about the Venus cycle. But like I was saying, with the Beatles, I think of each of them really corresponding really strongly to one of the planets. Like Ringo Starr was born during the Venus retrograde transit. He's the Venus retrograde guy, and I can talk about how that's the case for him. Paul McCartney is a Mars guy. The Mars synodic cycles in Paul McCartney's life are really, really strong. John Lennon was a Jupiter guy. The transits of Jupiter tend to really sort of be the significant arbiter of stuff for him. And then Saturn is George Harrison, very much a guy with Sun square Saturn, I believe, in his natal chart. Um, anyway, here we go. I'm going to share my screen again, and we'll have a look at the Beatles, both in my first in my sort of Venus synodic cycle thing, and then maybe sort of more broadly if that works for people. Okay, we're stuck on Aunt Mimi. So I look at everyone, not just the. Pardon me. Okay, so these are the intervals. Okay, now you remember I was showing you like how the Jacksons had three of the Jacksons were born in the same interval, and with the Beatles we get some similar things, some really interesting ones. For instance, Stu Sutcliffe and Ringo Starr were born about 2 weeks apart, and both have the Venus retrograde. Stu Sutcliffe has it in Cancer, retrograde in Cancer. He's a setting D red 3, whereas Ringo Starr is a Venus and Gemini rising B red 3. But they're born about 2 weeks apart. And they're both members of the Beatles, but they were never in the Beatles at the same time. And there's something really interesting about their sort of Venusian roles in the Beatles, because Stu Sutcliffe, okay, hopefully, like anyone who doesn't know the Beatles story who's listening to this is going to be a bit frustrating. So hopefully, you know their story, because I don't really feel this is a time and place to go through the whole origins. I want to just cut to the chase and get to the astrology of it. I mean, this is a super famous story. Even if you hate the Beatles, you probably know these stories and who these people are. Although I would have to question your judgment if you hate the Beatles. Anyway, some people do. Stu Sutcliffe he was a bass player in the Beatles. He wasn't really musically inclined. He bought a bass guitar because he was John's best friend. He won some kind of art contest. He got some big check for money. He didn't know what to do with the money, and John said, buy a bass. And he wound up playing bass with the Beatles. And he was with them when they toured Hamburg in Germany. They played in Hamburg as a 5-piece band. The Beatles started off as a 5-piece. And while there, he wound up falling in love with, where is she? This girl, Astrid Kircher, a German artist and photographer. And she's a black 3. Remember, Stu Sutcliffe is a red 3 with a setting D, and she's a setting C. Now they meet because her boyfriend Klaus Voormann, who's also a black 3 setting C, he's just a month older than Astrid. The story is that Klaus one day he gets in an argument with Astrid, and he goes off on his own to have a drink, and he goes into this nightclub, and the Beatles are playing there, and he has a drink, and he just gets he's just so into the band that he strikes up a friendship with them, and then he winds up bringing his friends to see the Beatles, and the friends include Astrid, and Astrid winds up falling in love with Stu. Right. Okay. Um, Now, this is interesting on so many levels. Really, seriously, the astrology is really interesting. Even if you're more of a Stones fan or more of a uh, you know K-pop fan or whatever, the story of these people and the way their lives sort of overlap is very, very interesting. The astrology is very interesting. Um, so Stu winds up when the Beatles wind up leaving Hamburg. Stu stays behind and becomes engaged to Astrid. But before this happens, a few things happen that are really, really key to the Beatles. First of all, Astrid is the one who for Klaus already has a sort of quasi Beatles hairstyle. It doesn't really show here, but I think when they met him, it was even more so. His hair was combed in his face, and it was Astrid who did it. See, she even kind of combed her own hair this way. But she winds up combing Stu's hair this way. Stu used to have sort of like a James Dean do until Astrid turned his hair into a Beatles hairstyle. So Stu is really like the first Beatle with the Beatle haircut. Oh yeah, and I think it's also Stu who named the Beatles. He was the one who saw um, the what's the Marlon Brando movie where he plays a biker and Lee Marvin's in the rival gang called the Beatles. Anyway, um, uh, it escapes me now. I do have a Marlon Brando file somewhere, but I won't go to it. I'm sure the movie will come to me. Whoops. Um, anyway, long story short, Stu Sutcliffe is this really important sort of, he's not musically inclined. He never would have been a good Beatle in their recording career. But as a sort of style maker, a taste maker, the Beatle haircuts will become really important, making them sort of stand out and be recognizable, when they become famous. So the fact that he's sort of involved in that, leading them that way is really interesting. The other thing about Astrid is she takes photos of the Beatles, and a lot of future Beatle photographers will mimic her style, this sort of like shadow and light style that people use with black and white photography. Now, the other thing about Klaus, this is really interesting. Now, remember, Stu Sutcliffe was an artist. Well, Klaus is also an artist. He's sort of a commercial artist, but he winds up taking up the bass guitar as well, and he gets to be a pretty good bass player. So as an artist, he winds up making the cover art for the Beatles' Revolver album. Stu Sutcliffe, of course, is long dead. He died in 62 from a brain aneurysm, probably from a head injury. But anyway, long story short, Klaus Voormann sort of winds up, first of all, as an artist, making this really memorable piece of art, the cover art for Revolver, but also more importantly, as a bass player, he winds up sort of becoming the new Stu Sutcliffe. Like Stu Sutcliffe kind of stole his girlfriend in a way. I think it was all relatively friendly, but then with Stu dying, Klaus sort of becomes the bass player. Like, when the Beatles break up, Klaus plays bass on George Harrison's All Things Must Pass and John Lennon's Plastic Ono Band and the Imagine singles and Instant Karma, and he's at the concert for Bangladesh with George Harrison. So he's in the middle of all that, basically substituting for Paul, but who was, of course, the bass player who came in, who stopped playing guitar to play bass in the Beatles after Stu left. So there's this sort of lineage between the two of them that's very interesting, and that happens with the Beatles, where there's a kind of switch over between two people. So going back to the Venus here, Ringo being the other red three. Ringo, musically is, and this isn't a put down, but he's the least sort of central figure of the four Beatles musically. He's the drummer. He has a very different role. Yeah, he wrote a couple of songs. Yeah, he sings here and there, but it's kind of a special feature thing. He's not one of the regular contributing Beatles. He's not even at George Harrison's sort of level of output. But nonetheless, Ringo is kind of the front man for the Beatles in terms of the PR. In the Beatle movies, he's sort of like the main character in Hard Day's Night and Help and Yellow Submarine. He's a frontman in a different kind of way, and even just, the fact that he's shorter and looks different and has this really standout name, right? I mean, the other guys are John, Paul, and George. They sound very ordinary, and then you get a Ringo in there. There's something sort of yeah, memorable about it. And so there's something about his role in that band as a frontman, even though he's not, the songwriter or the singer or anything like that. Um, he took over this role that Stu Sutcliffe had in a very different way. I find, Stu Sutcliffe is the frontman of sorts of the Beatles in 1960 in terms of like setting the image, the hairstyle, all that stuff. And then Ringo is sort of the front man later, in terms of them being these really sort of approachable, lovable mop tops, non-threatening. There's something about Ringo that's just got that sort of boy-like, non-threatening quality to him that I think, like, allowed the Beatles to slip under the radar, which was probably important as time went along. Um, Now, taking you through this, okay, John Lennon was a white 2. It's interesting. Remember, I showed you that Paul is a white 3. So the famous Lennon-McCartney partnership is, 2 people born in the white interval. Um, I'm gonna skip over the wives for now, not because they deserve to be ignored, but I just wanna get to some other points. And actually, when it comes to the wives, I'm more interested in talking about Mars. Yoko Ono with the Mars retrograde in Virgo, Linda McCartney with the Mars retrograde in Aries. There's very interesting stuff when it comes to Mars and the wives, but that's time for another talk, I think. Neil Aspinall is the Beatles' sort of road manager. And then George Martin, this is the other interesting thing, another sort of changeover is the Red Fours. The 2 Red Fours in the Beatles are George Martin and Pete Best. Okay, now I'm not related to this Pete Best, although we're both drummers. Um, but Pete Best was the Beatles drummer, basically until George Martin said he didn't want to use him in recordings, and the Beatles were like, "Well, we're thinking of replacing him anyway," and they brought in Ringo Starr. So it's funny. First of all, both Beatle drummers were born during the red intervals. Um, but here you have another thing, like okay, there was one time when George Martin recorded the Beatles with Pete Best. That was the first and last time. And the next time they would be together in a recording studio, it would be with Ringo doing "Love Me Do" for a single. But 2 people who represent 2 sort of different eras of the band, where they're sort of members of the band, but not. Pete Best, when he was in the Beatles, he was known for sort of going off on his own. He was the only one who didn't have a Beatles hairstyle. It was only after he left the Beatles, he wound up getting a Beatles hairstyle. But yeah, he didn't have a Beatles hairstyle while he was in the Beatles, and he didn't really hang out with the rest of them. The rest of them were a clique, and he kind of went off on his own. And he was just with them for show time, as opposed to Ringo, who really became like close friends with all the other guys in the Beatles. And George Martin, well, George Martin is really important in the Beatles' music. He was their producer. Again, if I really have to say too much about who George Martin was, I'm probably way ahead of you in this subject. Um, but he's someone who you can say is like also in his own way. Unlike, I mean, Pete Best wasn't nearly as involved in the music. Obviously, he was the drummer, but George Martin, while being hugely involved in the Beatles' music, so much so that musically speaking, he could be called the fifth Beatle more than anyone. There's a lot of stuff that in skill and knowledge that he had, that he made a lot of those amazing records possible. But obviously, he's not one of the Beatles. He's not smoking pot and taking LSD and sleeping with groupies and doing all that fun Beatles stuff. But he's sort of a member on the outside, if you will. Okay, well, Paul, I've already spoken about, so I don't want to hover on him too much. Brian Epstein, I'll get around to now. I mentioned that the Beatles, excuse me. I mentioned that the Beatles sort of all correspond to a planet in terms of which one seems to guide their lives with its cycle. Ringo being Venus, Paul being Mars, John being Jupiter, George being Saturn. Well, Brian Epstein is Mercury. he was born pretty close to a Mercury retrograde. And he's a Virgo and probably was a Virgo rising, although we're not 100% sure. I haven't used the birth time because it isn't confirmed. Um, but yeah, he's a really important sort of figure in the band. Blue twos do make there is something about blue twos being organized. Sometimes they're dictators. I wouldn't really say Brian Epstein was. Usually more when you get to the evening side, the setting A part of the blue two, you get sort of more dictatorial organizers like your J. Edgar Hoovers and your Stalins and your Ronald Reagans. But Brian Epstein was still, obviously had a lot of know-how and connections to help the Beatles along in their career. And he's a rising sea like Paul. That's the other thing that I wanted to point out is Ringo and John are rising bees. They're both setting E's. Paul and Brian are rising C's. And then you've got George, along with their trusty road manager, Mal Evans, are both setting A's, black ones. So George is the only Beatle who has a setting phase as opposed to a rising phase. And very often, I'll show you time and again, most often, when it comes to bands, you'll often have like three or one phase, and the other one is the other phase, and that one is usually something of a sort of outsider of sorts within the group. And George has that quality. I mean, George is the only Beatle who I think was legitimately miserable being in the Beatles. John might have complained about it, but I think he wasn't like George. Um, George is also the only Beatle who had transiting Saturn cross over his sun during the Beatle years, which, basically from 64 to 65, in the midst of like mega Beatlemania. That's exactly when George was at his most miserable with a heavy duty Saturn transit. So that sort of speaks for itself. As for other sort of peripheral figures, John's Aunt Mimi, who I think people are famous, know for having raised him, and his mother, Julia Lennon, who was killed in a car crash when John was 17. The two of them, even they're 8 years apart in age. They were sisters, but they're 8 years apart in age, and they're both blue fours. And I don't have much to add to that. It's just an interesting fact going there. All right, so that is the Beatles. Did anyone have comments? Why do I keep going there? Where's my window? Oh, no, that's also the wrong one. There we go. Okay. There was something else that I wanted to talk about. It's escaping me now. Does anyone have any questions? Apparently not. Okay. What else was I going to talk about? Oh yeah, I guess maybe I'll oh yes. I remember now. Okay. I want to show you guys another really interesting sort of Venus pattern that I've been looking at. There we are. Okay. That'll just take that'll just take a minute to open. Um, this is something called uh, Allies and Opponents, Revolutionary Red 4, Red 5, Black 2. It's just about, I'm going to pivot from music to politics. Oh, Jules has a question. Oh, I see a couple of questions here. Okay. Um, okay, so the first question from Fortune Amov or Amu, do I find that people have large events happen under the corresponding periods? Yeah, I mean, it, it's pretty amazing the way it works. If you know where sort of the Venus synodic cycles hit, then those are large events. Maybe you were asking specifically about the Beatles. I don't know. But yeah, that's the whole premise of what I'm doing here, is to illustrate how synodic cycles really correspond with large events in people's lives. Um, are there any other bands or groups that each member tapped into a specific synodic cycle? The Beatles story is interesting. Hard for me to say. Hard for me to say. There's no one that I have as developed a notion uh, with regard to that specific question as the Beatles, because it really became apparent. What I have noticed is I've looked at a lot of bands that have siblings or spouses in them, and there's a lot of Venus retrograde involved in that. And that was something else I was going to look at. But first, I just wanted to show you um, a curious thing with regard to revolutionaries, and maybe I'll pivot back to uh, um, music. But this is something else I wanted to cover while I can. Okay, I'm sharing my screen. Okay. All right. So there's something weird. Weird. Something interesting when it comes to the history of revolutions is that there's this thread that's evolved where we get someone born in the red 4 interval is really central in a revolution, but they have a rival sort of frenemy who's a red 5, and there'll be a period when the red 4 and the red 5 people are allies, and there'll be periods when the red 4 and red 5 allies are sort of enemies basically. So I wanted to run through this because it's kind of interesting the way it goes through. Hopefully you folks know history enough to know who I'm talking about here. First of all, in the French Revolution, you had Robespierre, who's a red 4 interval, and Danton, who's a red 5. If you don't know who these guys are, that's fine. I don't want to take you through the whole French Revolution, but long story short, okay, Danton was executed on April 5th, 1794, in part because Robespierre and others voted for him to go to the guillotine. And when Danton was in the cage carriage taking him to the guillotine, they went by Robespierre's house, and he said, "Robespierre, you'll be next." And he wasn't wrong, because the following July 28th, Robespierre was indeed next and went to the guillotine. So they had been allies earlier in the revolution, and then there was a break between them, and one was involved in having the other sent to the guillotine before the other guy wound up at the guillotine. But that's the French Revolution for you. Right. Then we get to the Russian Revolution, and Lenin, like Robespierre, is a red 4 interval, and Trotsky is a red 5 interval. And Lenin and Trotsky start off as allies. Then there's a period when Lenin breaks away with the Bolsheviks. Trotsky doesn't go with the Bolsheviks. He actually goes with the opposite faction, although breaks with them eventually too. But there is a period of a good 12 years or so, or more, 14 years, I think, where Trotsky and Lenin are basically, if not enemies, at least, opponents. But then, when the February Revolution happens in 1917, Trotsky comes around to Lenin's side, and together they're involved in the October Revolution. But here's another example. Okay, so neither sends the other to the guillotine, but here you have another example of the Red Four revolutionary, that being Lenin and Robespierre, and the Red Five revolutionary, that being Trotsky and Danton. Then we go to China and we get Mao Zedong, who is also a Red Four, like Lenin and like Robespierre. And he has his nemesis is Chiang Kai-shek, who is a Red Five. If you folks don't know Chinese history, again, I'll just go it very quickly. But there was a Chinese Civil War predating the Japanese invasion and the Second World War, but also following the Japanese invasion and the Second World War. And during the Japanese invasion, Mao and Chiang Kai-shek, even though they'd been opponents at war quite bitterly, for a good decade or so in the 20s and 30s. When Japan invaded China, they ultimately decided to have an alliance and fight the Japanese together, which they did. And then once Japan was defeated, they went back to fighting each other until 1949, when Chiang Kai-shek and his people went over to Taiwan, and Mao declared mainland China, the People's Republic, so on and so forth. So again, you have. I just wanted to say there's this interesting sort of recurrence of these Red Four guys and these Red Five guys, and the sort of back and forth that they wind up going through. Um, what was the other thing I was going to say? There are some interesting other factors. Oh yeah, yeah. There's something in the 60s. You get a lot of these like Red Four, Black Two combinations. So Martin Luther King is a Black Two interval, whereas Ralph Abernathy, who was like, virtually his sort of partner uh, uh, in so much of his crusade, generally standing by his side. He was a Red Four. So you get these. This was really like a recurring thing in the 60s, where you have the Red Four and the Black Two as a sort of pair. Another was in the Weathermen. You had Bernardine Dorn, who's a Red Four, and Bill Ayers, who's a Black Two, and they were, sort of I don't know if there were any leaders in the Weathermen, but she was certainly like the most visible spokesperson. He was right up there. With the Black Panthers, you had Huey Newton was a Red Four, and Bobby Seale was a Black Two. But you also get, like, in the Black Panthers, that whole story I was saying about the Red Four and the Red Four and the Red Five. Sure enough, Eldridge Cleaver was a Red Five. So you got Huey Newton's a Red Four and Eldridge Cleaver's a Red Five. And once again, just like with Robespierre and Danton, and just like with Lenin and Trotsky, and just like with Mao and Chiang Kai-shek, you get the Red Four and Red Five, who sometimes they're allies and sometimes they're not. And yeah, so that is what it is. Um, a lot of others, Fred Hampton was a Red Three. A lot of sort of, the major sort of Black Panthers were born in the Red Five interval. Um, yeah, and there's just, speaking of the French Revolution, other important figures for those of you who know the history. Madame de Stael was a Red Four. She's like an important proto-feminist from this era. She had to live in exile during the Reign of Terror. She certainly would have gone to the guillotine if she hadn't. Some people who did go to the guillotine, Red Fives, more Red Fives, along with Danton. This is Hérault de Seychelles. He was he was on the Committee for Public Safety with Robespierre, but he went to the guillotine alongside Danton that same day, April 5th. And then two guys who went to the guillotine with Robespierre. One was the chief of the Paris National Guard, François Hariot. He went along with Robespierre to the guillotine July 28th, as did Louis Saint-Just, who was Robespierre's sort of partner on the Committee for Public Safety. He was a Red Five. He's a young guy. So at least two Red Fives executed rather, alongside Robespierre on July 28th. So you find these concentration of people born during the Red intervals. at revolutionary times, no doubt about it. This guy, Louis Saint Just, anytime you see a dramatic performance of the French Revolution, this guy will always be played by some, handsome young actor with like hair over his eyes and like a male model type figure. Uh, uh, yeah, sort of, angel of death, angel faced angel of death. Anyway, I ramble on. There's all kinds of other figures in here. Uh, um, what else can I say? Oh, yeah, I know what I'll talk about next. One more little revolutionary story, and then maybe I'll do something on music. Oops. All right, bear with me. This shouldn't take too long. Okay, apologize for not clarifying better. I meant to ask if a red 4 tends to have events happen only in other red 4 periods, or do they have a pattern where, let's say, they get triggered during a black 3? Yeah, no, it's not always the same as the natal pattern. Um, that's a really good question. Thank you for that. For instance, like Winston Churchill and Charles de Gaulle were both born during red 2 patterns, but actually events in both their lives really corresponded more closely to red 3 intervals. So it isn't always the same. And you get people also who aren't even born during a red interval, that the red intervals are really powerful. The Venus retrogrades are powerful. I just had a client this morning with something like that. The way you can often tell, if you know the 5 places that the Venus retrogrades happen, the easiest thing to do is look if they have the ascendant or the sun or the moon in the path of any of the 5 retrogrades, and then you know that's someone who gets an extended Venus retrograde every 8 years. So I saw someone this morning who had a late Aquarius ascendant. So right away I knew that Venus retrograde in Leo crossed her descendant every 8 years, and sure enough, when we went into the timeline, um, yeah, her life was really sort of very acutely, notably guided by that Venus retrograde in Leo. You could really sort of see how it started a new chapter. So it spoke really clearly and plainly to her, and that's a really common experience I get when I show people how the Venus synodic cycles, how those transits have played out in their natal chart. But the context comes with the natal chart in the person's life. Broadly speaking, the answer to the question is yeah, no, you don't have to be born during that red 4 interval for it to be a powerful transit in your life. Um, it's just once you identify one of those intervals as a major transit point, you can really sort of see it. Okay, I just wanted to speak about another little revolutionary episode that I find really interesting. Um, from the perspective of the Venus synodic cycle. Okay. Um, Ireland. Um, okay, I don't have a chart for the actual event in here, so I'll start with the database and then I'll take you into the slide. So in 1916, in the middle of the First World War, Ireland was already gearing up for independence, which was kind of put off, if you will, discussion when the war broke out, and some people were getting impatient, and there was an uprising in Dublin. on Easter, well, the Saturday before Easter. It's often called the Easter Uprising, and it was on the 22nd of April, 1916. And you can see that Venus here is an evening star. It's 50 days from its retrograde station, which means it's just entered the red 3 interval. So this is Venus in the red interval, slowing down to its retrograde. It's just, it's not retrograde yet. It's 50 days, but 51 days is when the interval begins. And it's when Venus is at its greatest eastern elongation. Greatest western elongation. And so it's at its greatest distance from the sun, and it's slowing down to its eventual retrograde, and this red interval has begun. No, I'm not going to take you through 100 years of Irish history. I just want to talk about this one particular day. But you do get some really interesting things if you do go through Irish history. There's some really interesting Venus retrograde stuff. But first, I want to talk about a couple of men who were there that day. One guy who's there. Basically, what I should tell you about the uprising is it's eventually put down by the army, and a lot of the leadership are executed. I think there's a total of 20 men who are executed, including the 7 leaders, and I'll talk about them in a moment. But some people are not executed. Some of the men are just kept in prison. This is Eamon de Valera. He is one of the rebels on that day, and he is arrested with the others, but he is not executed, possibly because he was actually born in New York, which I think gives him an American passport, or at least some kind of connection to, close enough a connection to America that the British Army didn't want to risk angering the Americans by executing him. So he winds up in prison, but eventually he'll be Prime Minister of Ireland for a very long time. 40 years, if I'm not mistaken, or somewhere around there. Definitely from like the 30s to the 60s, or 30s to the 70s even. It might have even been longer than 40 years. Very, very long time. But a really important figure in Irish Republican politics. Alongside, so he's a red 2 interval, just to show you that. Alongside him, another important guy who's there that day but is not executed after the uprising is Michael Collins. Some of you might know his name because what's his name played a movie called Michael Collins. Well, who's the actor? Who am I thinking of, guys? Liam Neeson. Liam Neeson played Michael Collins. There's a movie called Michael Collins. It was made in the 90s. He's amongst Sinn Féin. He's part of sort of like when he gets out of prison after the uprising, he gets involved in this sort of guerrilla warfare with the British, they're called Black and Tans. It's a really bloody period in Irish history, where they're fighting the Black and Tans, and then there's a sort of civil war between 2 factions within the Irish independence movement. It gets really, and he's murdered going into that in 1922. But he helped negotiate. Michael Collins is a red 2, and so was Winston Churchill, and they actually negotiate together along with 2 others, the partition of Ireland, which is the main sort of factor that causes the split between factions to break out. Those who are against partition and those who are in favor of it. De Valera is against it, and so he holds out. But Collins is sort of for it because it'll help calm down the violence. But he's assassinated because he's seen as a traitor. Anyway, they're both red 2s. But going back to the uprising, there are 7 major signatories, 7 men. Like I said, there's a total of 20 who are executed, but there's 7 signatories during the Easter uprising, on the sort of proclamation that declares an independent Republic of Ireland. Before you can have the actual thing exist, you have to have the intention, the statement, and that's what this declaration involves. And the interesting thing is, remember, Venus has just gone into a red 3 interval when this uprising happens, and it turns out most of those 7 guys were born during red intervals, and I'll introduce you to them now in no particular order. First, since I'm right here, this is Sean McD Armada. He's one of the co-signers of the Proclamation of the Irish Republic, executed May 12th, 1916, and he's a red 2 interval. James Connolly, who's a red 3 interval. He was also executed on May 12th. He also co-signed the Irish Republic Proclamation. So he's a red 3 interval. Following that with Thomas McDonough, executed May 3rd. So that's a good 9 days before the other two. And he's a red 4 interval. He's another one of these 7 co-signers. Then there's Patrick Piers, who's possibly maybe the most famous of these, because he's the one who I believe who reads the proclamation during they take the post office under siege. He's executed May 3rd, so alongside McDonough, and he's a red 5 interval, and he's not even the only one who's a red 5 interval. There's also Joseph Plunkett, who's also so 2 of the 7 are red 5 intervals. And Joseph Plunkett, I think, was in fragile health. He had tuberculosis, but he's very courageous on the day. He's executed May 4th. And I don't have the other 2. Okay, I mean, I don't have them in the slides. I haven't finished making this, but I will just show you their charts instead. I have a feeling I know why. So I showed you 5, and they were all red interval guys. And then there is, wait, where are they? Let's see. Sorry for the hold up, folks. All right. Sorry. Basically, I don't want to waste your time looking for that, so I will just tell you. I showed you 5 of the 7 who were all born under the red interval. There's a 6th guy who was born during a black interval, and then the 7th, there's a dispute over his birth year. The given birth year says would make him a blue 4, but then in his biography, his wife says he was actually born a year earlier, which would make him a red 1. And she said that for some reason the wrong year was always being given out, but she knew his correct birth year. She was his wife. So in other words, that Irish Easter uprising occurred during a red 3 interval. At least 5, probably 6 of the 7 leaders of that uprising were born during the red interval. I've got a lot of stories like this where, just like in these really specific instances, there just seems to be a really large concentration of red interval people, people with born during red intervals involved who have a central role in the story. And that's something that I'm just sort of following. I don't, have some grand answers as to what it means. Like I said, when I use this, when I use the synodic cycles in a chart reading, then it has a very sort of specific application relative to a person's natal chart and all the things involved there. Is it crossing angles? Is it crossing natal planets? Is it interacting with the sun and moon? Because it'll do it every 8 years. But that aside, just in the sense of using astrology to look at the world, to try and understand more about how these planets sort of play out in day-to-day life, and maybe in areas that we don't necessarily associate them, then this kind of exercise is really worth it. So yeah, that's what I have to say about revolutions for now. Now let me see here. Okay. Does the Venus depositor have a role in the Venus cycle? It does once you're getting to the chart reading level. In its own right, it seems to it spends an equal number of time in all the signs. Um, but it takes 251 years for it to sort of change through all the signs. So at any given time, Venus only goes retrograde through 5 of the 12 signs, or maybe it'll be moving from one to another. Um, so how do I answer this? In the 19th century, you always had Venus retrogrades in Libra and Taurus, whereas in the 20th century, you had Venus retrogrades in Aries and Scorpio. So in the 19th century, you had Venus making retrogrades in two of its own domiciles. And in the 20th century, you had Venus making retrogrades in two of its counter domiciles. Um, I wouldn't say that like the Venus retrograde in Scorpio is better or worse than the Venus retrograde in Taurus, or weaker or stronger. That gets really tricky. That you need to get into the intricacy of a given natal chart to really make those sort of more defined statements. After all, Hitler had Venus retrograde in Taurus, so okay, that doesn't sound great. Um, but neither does Venus retrograde in Scorpio. I guess there are some pretty cool people who have Venus retrograde in Scorpio, but there were aside Hitler aside, there were also some pretty cool people with Venus and Taurus. So yeah, I think it does play a role once you get into the proper horoscopic astrology level of reading a chart, where you're looking at houses and planets are making aspects, and so you're looking at dispositorship in that sort of context. If you're taking this sort of broader view like I'm doing, and you're just looking at it moving uh, through people's lives, then it's just a little bit less so, because you're looking at too much at once to sort of get into the minutiae of rulership. All right. Do I have any other questions? I think I'm kind of, oh, wait here. What's this other one? I read a 2015 Austin Coppock article on the Venus retrograde in Leo, some work I've done on this cycle. If I plan anything to discuss on this upcoming cycle. Well, Kate, I do have a video on my YouTube channel called Introduction to the Venus Synodic Cycle. It sort of, it lays out the foundation. It's a good introduction. It just tells you exactly what it is I'm talking about. And aside from that, I'm going to use forums like this live stream. I'm working on some other videos to talk about this. It was nice of Austin. I remember that article where he mentioned it. That was nice of him to do that. But yeah, stay tuned to my live stream. Subscribe to my YouTube channel. And I also, of course, I offer consultations, and I talk about this material often with clients, relative to their own natal charts. And even people who've been studying astrology a long time, often come to me to look into this kind of material, because there isn't a lot written about it. Ariel Gutman does have a good book on the Venus cycle, but yeah, that's one book, and there's definitely a lot in that book a lot that isn't covered in that book that I cover in these live streams. So, you don't want to get everything from one source. Oh, well, thank you, Kate. Stay tuned. Subscribe wherever you're subscribing. I'm doing live streams Sunday and Monday, sometimes with Patrick Watson, sometimes without. Patrick said he'd be ready at about 2 p.m., so I'm going to take a little break. And if he is indeed ready to live stream at 2, I'll be back with him. And if for some reason he can't, because this is Mother's Day and I have to take my mother out for dinner later, if for some reason he can't, then I'll just see you folks tomorrow, with or without Patrick. He's got his own, we're both family men, so sometimes it's just family comes first, and he's got to deal with that. But it'll be nice to have him if he can join me. At some point he will. So yeah, I'm going to take a break for now, and like I said, 2 o'clock ish, all depending on the man himself, will reappear, probably, hopefully. All right, bye for now. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you so much.